The train screeched like a wounded iron beast as it clawed its way across the endless plains of Montana Territory. Smoke curled into the pale sky, drifting like ghosts over miles of frost-bitten grass. Inside one of the rear passenger cars, Clara Whitmore sat stiffly against the velvet seat, her gloved hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned bone-white beneath the lace. She had counted the hours since Chicago. 73. Not that she expected anyone to meet her when the train stopped. Not anymore. Clara stared out the narrow window, watching the snow-speckled prairie blur into a smear of gray and silver. Each mile carried her further from everything she had ever known, and closer to the man who had chosen her from a catalog as if she were a bolt of fabric or a sack of flour. A mail-order bride. The words tasted bitter in her mind, though she had repeated them to herself every day for the last 2 months, trying to make them feel noble instead of desperate. Her father had died in the influenza outbreak the previous winter. Her mother had followed 3 weeks later, her heart simply giving out from grief and exhaustion. Clara's younger brother had been taken in by an uncle in St. Louis, leaving her alone in a city that had never been kind to unmarried women without family or fortune. She had answered the advertisement out of necessity, not romance. Ranch owner seeks wife of steady disposition. Must be capable of managing household and assisting with livestock accounts. Children desired. The signature had been bold and confident. Thomas Calder. His letters had been brief but polite, practical. He had asked about her education, her cooking abilities, her health. He had never asked about her dreams, and she had never asked about his heart. The train jolted violently as it began to slow, throwing her slightly forward. Outside, a tiny wooden platform appeared beside a sagging station building that looked as though it had surrendered to the wind years ago. The conductor's voice echoed through the car. "Last stop, Cold Creek Junction." Clara swallowed hard. This was it. Passengers gathered their belongings with hurried efficiency, but Clara moved slowly, carefully smoothing her navy traveling dress. The garment had been her mother's final gift to her, altered twice to fit her smaller frame. It was elegant by frontier standards, though the hem was already dusted with soot from the journey. She rose, lifting her single leather trunk with more determination than strength. A kindly older woman passing by paused long enough to steady it for her. "You meeting your husband here, dear?" the woman asked gently. Clara hesitated. "I believe so." The uncertainty slipped out before she could stop it. The woman gave her a sympathetic smile that lingered too long, as if she understood more than Clara had said. Then she disappeared down the aisle with the rest of the passengers. Moments later, Clara stepped onto the wooden platform. The cold hit her like a slap. Wind tore across the open land, whipping her bonnet ribbons against her cheeks as she scanned the small crowd gathered near the station. A few rugged men waited beside wagons and horses, their hats pulled low, their coats heavy with trail dust and snow. Her heart pounded as she searched their faces. None of them stepped forward. A tall man with a red beard glanced at her briefly before turning away. Another spat tobacco into the snow and climbed onto his wagon without a second look. One by one, the remaining men collected crates, greeted relatives, or mounted their horses and rode off into the vast whiteness. Within minutes, the platform emptied. Clara stood alone beside her trunk, the whistle of the departing train slicing through the air behind her. She didn't turn around to watch it leave. She couldn't bear to see her last connection to the east vanish into the distance. He wasn't coming. The realization settled over her slowly, like snow accumulating on a grave. Perhaps he had changed his mind. Perhaps he had married someone else. Perhaps he had never intended to come at all. Her throat tightened, but she refused to cry. She had shed too many tears over the last year, and they had solved nothing. "Miss Whitmore." The voice startled her. It was deep, roughened by wind and dust, yet unexpectedly gentle. She turned. A man stood several yards away, half shadowed by the station's overhang. He was tall, impossibly tall, she thought, with broad shoulders wrapped in a weathered brown duster. His dark hat obscured much of his face, but she could see the strong line of his jaw and a neatly trimmed beard dusted with frost. He held the reins of a massive black stallion that pawed impatiently at the snow. "Yes," she said cautiously. "I am Clara Whitmore." The man stepped closer, removing his hat. His hair was the color of burnished oak, streaked faintly with sun-bleached strands. But it was his eyes that made her breath hitch, clear gray, sharp and searching like storm clouds that had learned to think. "I'm Samuel Hale," he said. "I was sent to collect you." The words struck her with quiet confusion. "Sent by Mr. Calder." Samuel hesitated, and that brief pause told her more than any explanation could have. "Thomas asked me to bring you to the ranch," he said carefully. Clara's stomach dropped. "He didn't come himself." Samuel's gaze shifted toward the empty horizon before returning to her. He's occupied. The answer felt rehearsed. Hollow Clara forced herself to nod. I see. Samuel studied her for a moment, as if weighing something unspoken. His eyes flicked toward her modest trunk, then back to her pale face. You traveled alone, he asked. Yes, that took courage. She almost laughed at that, but the sound caught in her chest and dissolved into a shaky breath instead. Samuel lifted her trunk as if it weighed nothing and secured it onto a sturdy wagon parked nearby. He worked efficiently, his movements deliberate and practiced, yet there was an unusual care in the way he handled her belongings. When he finished, he turned and extended his hand to help her climb aboard. His glove brushed hers, sending an unexpected warmth through her frozen fingers. Clara hesitated only a moment before accepting the gesture. As the wagon rolled away from the station, she allowed herself one final glance backward. The platform was already half buried beneath drifting snow, the tracks fading into white nothingness. Monsieur, hail, she said quietly after several minutes of silence. Does Mr. Calder know I've arrived? Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He knows, he said. The wagon creaked across the frozen ground, heading toward distant mountains that rose like silent judges along the horizon. The sky darkened with gathering clouds, promising a storm before nightfall. Clara clasped her hands together in her lap, her heart pounding with dread she could not explain. She had crossed a continent to begin a new life, but deep in her bones, she felt as though she had just arrived at the edge of something far more uncertain than loneliness. Beside her, Samuel Hale stared ahead into the storm, his expression carved from stone, and neither of them spoke again for the rest of the journey. The storm arrived faster than Samuel predicted. By the time the wagon crested the last ridge overlooking Calder Ranch, the sky had collapsed into a swirling curtain of white. Wind howled across the open land with the fury of something alive, driving needles of snow against Clara's face despite the blanket Samuel had wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She could barely see through the blizzard, but slowly shapes began to emerge from the storm dark, sprawling silhouettes against the pale earth. The ranch was enormous. A massive timber house stood at the center, flanked by long barns and corrals stretching across the valley floor. Smoke poured from 3 chimneys, twisting violently into the wind. Scattered ranch hands hurried between buildings, their figures hunched like shadows battling the storm. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had expected something modest, perhaps even struggling. Instead, this place carried the quiet authority of wealth, built through sweat and stubborn survival. Samuel pulled the wagon to a stop near the front porch, jumping down before the wheels had fully settled. He hurried to her side, offering his arm. Storm's worsening, he said firmly. Let's get you inside. Clara nodded, gripping his arm as she stepped down. The moment her boots touched the frozen ground, the wind nearly knocked her sideways. Samuel steadied her, his grip strong but respectful, guiding her quickly toward the house. The front door swung open before they reached it. A tall, sharply dressed woman stood inside, her dark hair pinned tightly beneath a lace headpiece. Her eyes were cold and calculating as they swept over Clara from bonnet to boots. You actually brought her, the woman said, her voice thin with displeasure. Samuel's expression hardened. She was expected. The woman stepped aside reluctantly, allowing them to enter. Warmth from the roaring fireplace washed over Clara, making her knees tremble from the sudden contrast. She removed her gloves slowly, trying to ignore the stranger's relentless stare. I am Margaret Doyle, the woman said, housekeeper and overseer of domestic affairs. Her tone made it clear she considered herself far more important than the title suggested. Clara Whitmore, Clara replied softly. Margaret nodded once, unimpressed. You're late, she said bluntly. Clara blinked in surprise. The train arrived precisely when. I'm not referring to the train, Margaret interrupted. Mr. Calder married Miss Eleanor Brooks yesterday morning. The words struck like a rifle shot. Clara's ears rang as the room tilted slightly around her. She stared at Margaret, waiting for someone, anyone, to correct the statement. Samuel's silence confirmed it. I don't understand, Clara whispered. Margaret crossed her arms. Mr. Calder believed you had reconsidered your arrangement. Your final letter arrived weeks behind schedule. By then, Miss Brooks had accepted his proposal. Clara's mind raced. She remembered writing her last letter. She had mailed it the very day she sold her mother's locket to afford the train ticket. She had poured every ounce of determination into those words. I never withdrew, she said, her voice trembling. I came exactly as promised. Margaret shrugged with chilling indifference. The matter is settled regardless. Clara's chest tightened painfully. Every mile she had traveled, every memory she had buried had been for nothing. Then why was I brought here? She asked, turning slowly toward Samuel. Before he could answer, the front door burst open again. A man strode into the house, shaking snow from his heavy coat. He was broad and imposing, with slick blonde hair and sharp blue eyes that immediately locked onto Clara. Thomas Calder. Clara recognized him from the small photograph he had included in his first letter. But in person, he appeared colder, more rigid, like a man carved from ice rather than flesh. "So," Thomas said flatly, removing his gloves, "you decided to arrive after all." Clara swallowed hard. "There must have been a misunderstanding." "There was," he interrupted, "but it is no longer my concern." His words sliced through the air with brutal finality. "I have honored my commitments," he continued. "You are unfortunately an inconvenience." The humiliation burned through Clara like fire. She felt Margaret's satisfied gaze. She felt Samuel's silent tension beside her. Most of all, she felt the crushing weight of realization she had nowhere left to go. "I can leave tomorrow," Clara said quietly, "if you could direct me to the nearest boarding house." "There isn't one," Thomas replied curtly. "The nearest town is 3 days' ride in good weather. You'd never survive the journey alone." Clara's hope flickered and died in the same moment. Thomas sighed impatiently. "You may remain here temporarily as hired help until spring. You'll earn enough to fund your return east. Margaret will assign your duties." The offer sounded less like mercy and more like a sentence. Clara lowered her gaze. "Thank you," she whispered, though the words tasted like ash. Thomas turned toward the staircase. "See that she's properly outfitted. We cannot have guests mistaking her for family." The comment landed with deliberate cruelty. As Thomas disappeared upstairs, Margaret smiled thinly. "Come along, Miss Whitmore. The servant quarters are this way." Clara followed silently, each step echoing with the slow collapse of every fragile dream she had carried across the continent. Behind them, Samuel remained standing near the door, his jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle twitched along his cheek. The servant quarters were small but clean, tucked behind the main kitchen wing. Clara sat alone on the narrow bed, staring at the rough wooden walls as wind rattled the shutters outside. Hours had passed since her arrival. Margaret had assigned her duties without warmth or patience: laundry, inventory logs, poultry feeding, and meal preparation assistance. Every instruction carried the same unspoken message: you are temporary and unwelcome. Clara removed her bonnet slowly, placing it beside her trunk. Her reflection in the small mirror above the washbasin startled her. The journey had hollowed her cheeks, and exhaustion darkened her eyes. For the first time since leaving Chicago, tears finally came. They slid silently down her face as she pressed her hands against her mouth to stifle the sound. She cried for her parents, for the brother she might never see again, for the future that had evaporated within minutes of stepping off the train. A sudden crash of thunder rattled the entire building. Clara flinched, forcing herself to stand. She needed air, space, anything to quiet the storm inside her chest. Pulling on her coat, she slipped out the back door into the swirling snowfall. The ranch yard was nearly deserted now, most workers sheltering in the barns. Drawn by instinct rather than reason, Clara walked toward the largest stable structure, its lanterns glowing faintly through the storm. Inside, warmth and the earthy scent of hay wrapped around her instantly. Horses shifted in their stalls, snorting softly as snow blew through the open doorway behind her. She moved deeper into the barn, running her fingers along the wooden partitions, finding comfort in the steady rhythm of the animals' breathing. "You shouldn't be out here alone." The voice came from the shadows. Clara turned sharply to find Samuel leaning against a support beam, his sleeves rolled, his hands dusted with straw and dirt. "I needed quiet," she admitted. Samuel studied her face carefully, his expression softening when he noticed the tear tracks she hadn't fully wiped away. "This place can be cruel to new arrivals," he said quietly. "I wasn't supposed to be new," she replied, her voice cracking. "I was supposed to belong here." The confession hung heavy between them. Samuel pushed himself off the beam, walking toward her slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal. "You still might," he said. Clara shook her head. "Not after today." A sudden loud whinny echoed from the far stall. Samuel turned instantly, his focus snapping into sharp alertness. "Stay here," he ordered gently. Ignoring the instruction, Clara followed as Samuel hurried toward the back of the barn. A large chestnut mare thrashed inside her stall, her eyes wide with panic. A newborn foal lay motionless in the straw beside her. "She's rejecting it," Samuel muttered grimly, kneeling beside the trembling animal. Clara watched helplessly as he worked to calm the mare, speaking in low, soothing murmurs. His voice carried a strange, steady authority, as if the animals instinctively trusted him. Minutes passed before the mare finally stilled, allowing Samuel to check the foal. Relief flickered across his face when the small creature stirred weakly beneath his hands. "He'll live," Samuel said softly. Clara stepped closer, mesmerized by the fragile life struggling to stand. The foal wobbled unsteadily, collapsing twice before finally rising on trembling legs. Something inside Clara broke open at the sight. "It doesn't know it was unwanted," she whispered. Samuel looked up sharply. The storm howled against the barn walls, but inside, a fragile stillness formed between them. "You are not unwanted," he said quietly. Clara laughed bitterly. Mr. Calder would disagree. Samuel rose slowly, stepping closer until only inches separated them. Snowmelt glistened in his hair, and the lantern light softened the severity of his features. "Thomas sees contracts," Samuel said. "He sees transactions. He has forgotten how to see people." Clara searched his face, surprised by the quiet intensity burning in his gray eyes. "And you?" she asked. Samuel hesitated, as though crossing a line he had drawn long ago. "I see a woman who crossed half a country alone," he said. "I see strength, a loyalty, courage most men here could never match." Clara's breath caught. The barn seemed suddenly smaller, warmer, charged with something fragile and dangerous. Samuel reached out slowly, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face with a gentleness that made her heart pound violently. "If this world had any justice," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm, "I would ask you to stay." Clara stared at him, her pulse roaring in her ears. Samuel's hand hovered against her cheek for one suspended moment before he spoke the words that would change both their lives forever. "Be the mother of my children." The storm outside raged louder, but inside the barn, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Clara stared at Samuel as his words settled between them like a spark dropped into dry prairie grass. The lantern beside them flickered wildly, casting golden shadows across the barn walls, but she could barely see anything except his face, steady, serious, and entirely without mockery. He was not smiling. He was not teasing. He looked like a man who had spent years thinking carefully before speaking a single sentence, and had finally chosen to speak. "You don't mean that," Clara whispered, though a fragile thread of hope had already begun weaving itself around her heart. Samuel lowered his hand slowly, as if afraid his touch might frighten her away. "I have never meant anything more clearly in my life," he said. Clara's breath trembled.
"You barely know me. I know enough,"
he replied quietly. "I know you honored a promise that most would have abandoned. I know you walked into humiliation today with dignity, and I know this ranch has not seen kindness like yours in years." She shook her head, stepping back slightly, her pulse racing. "You're speaking from pity." Samuel's jaw tightened. "I don't pity you." "Then why?" she asked, desperation breaking through her composure. "Why would you say something like that to a woman you met only hours ago?" For a long moment, Samuel didn't answer. The horses shifted restlessly around them, their hooves scraping against straw as the storm battered the barn doors. Finally, he exhaled slowly. "Because I've watched this ranch break every good thing that tried to grow here," he said. "And when I saw you step off that wagon, I realized you might be the first chance it's had in a long time to be something better." Clara's chest tightened painfully. "That sounds like a responsibility, not a marriage." Samuel stepped closer again, his voice lowering. "It would be both," he admitted. "And it would be honest." The simplicity of his answer unsettled her more than any romantic speech could have. There were no grand declarations of love, no poetic promises of eternal devotion, only a quiet, unwavering certainty. "I can't be your solution," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I'm not asking you to be a solution," Samuel replied. "I'm asking you to build something real with me." The foal behind them stumbled again, nudging weakly against its mother's side. The mare lowered her head cautiously, sniffing the newborn as if reconsidering her earlier rejection. Clara watched the fragile interaction unfold, feeling something stir deep inside her chest. "You don't even know if I want children," she said softly. Samuel's expression gentled. "Do you?" Clara hesitated. She had never allowed herself to imagine such a future. Survival had always demanded louder attention than dreams. But as she watched the mare nudge the foal upright, she felt a quiet longing she had buried for years begin to surface. "I think I would," she admitted. Samuel nodded slowly, as though confirming something he had already suspected. "Then consider my words an invitation," he said. "Not a demand, not a rescue, an invitation." Silence settled between them again, heavy but not uncomfortable. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, trying to steady the storm of emotions rising inside her. "What would Thomas say?" she asked finally. Samuel's expression darkened. "Thomas would see it as betrayal. And Margaret? She would see it as war." Clara almost smiled at that, though fear quickly smothered the humor. "I've already caused enough trouble simply by arriving," she said. I won't destroy whatever fragile piece exists here. Samuel studied her carefully, then spoke with quiet firmness. There is no peace here, Clara. Only routine and resentment. His honesty struck her harder than she expected. She had sensed the tension in the house earlier, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel dangerously real. Why stay here at all? She asked. You could leave, start your own ranch. Samuel's gaze drifted toward the far wall of the barn, his eyes shadowed with memories he did not immediately share. This land belonged to my father, he said at last. He and Thomas built this ranch together before either of them married. When my father died, Thomas bought out his share to keep the ranch whole. I stayed on as foreman because it felt like the only way to honor what my father helped create. Clara absorbed the revelation slowly. And now, Samuel said quietly, I'm not sure the ranch resembles anything my father would recognize. Another gust of wind slammed against the barn, rattling the doors violently. Samuel glanced toward the entrance, his protective instincts clearly battling with his desire to continue the conversation. You should go back inside, he said reluctantly. The storm's worsening. Clara nodded, though neither of them moved immediately. Samuel, she said after a moment. Yes. If I said yes. She hesitated, struggling to form the fragile question. Would it be because you truly want me, or because you believe I deserve saving? Samuel stepped closer once more, his gray eyes burning with quiet intensity. If you said yes, he said softly, it would be because you chose me, and I would spend every day proving you made the right choice. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs, but before she could respond, the barn doors burst open with a thunderous crash. Margaret Doyle stood framed in the swirling snow, her face flushed with fury. There you are, she snapped. Mr. Calder is searching for his foreman, not his stable boy. Her eyes flicked between Clara and Samuel, instantly calculating the charged atmosphere. I trust I am not interrupting anything inappropriate, she added coldly. Samuel straightened, his expression hardening into the disciplined mask Clara had first seen at the station. I was tending to the mare, he said evenly. Margaret's lips curled slightly. Of course you were. Her gaze shifted to Clara, filled with undisguised disdain. And you, Miss Whitmore, were assigned laundry duty, not midnight barn visits. Clara lowered her gaze, her cheeks burning with humiliation. Yes, Mom. Margaret turned sharply toward the door. Return to the house immediately. Mr. Calder expects all staff at morning briefing before sunrise. We cannot afford distractions. Clara moved toward the exit, her heart heavy with words left unspoken. As she passed Samuel, their hands brushed briefly, sending a silent current of understanding between them. Neither dared speak again, but both knew something irreversible had begun. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of tarnished steel. The storm had passed, leaving the ranch buried beneath thick drifts of snow that sparkled deceptively beneath the weak sunlight. Clara rose before dawn, her body aching from exhaustion but her mind too restless to allow sleep. She dressed quickly in the plain work garments Margaret had provided, a coarse wool skirt, a faded blouse, and an apron that smelled faintly of lye soap. The clothing stripped away any remaining illusion that she might ever be considered anything more than hired help. As she stepped into the kitchen, she found Margaret already directing the servants with brisk efficiency. Pots clanged, bread dough was kneaded aggressively, and coffee brewed in enormous kettles strong enough to revive the dead. You're late, Margaret said without turning. Clara glanced at the clock above the stove. She was 3 minutes early. I apologize, Clara said anyway. Margaret gestured sharply toward a stack of linens. Those require folding before breakfast service. Clara moved to obey, her hands working mechanically while her thoughts drifted relentlessly back to the barn. Samuel's voice echoed in her memory, his words weaving themselves into her heart despite her efforts to remain sensible. Be the mother of my children. The phrase both terrified and comforted her in equal measure. Footsteps thundered across the hallway moments later as ranch hands entered for breakfast, their laughter and boots filling the room with rough energy. Clara kept her head lowered, focusing on her work, until she heard Thomas Calder's voice. We'll begin cattle counts tomorrow, he announced loudly. Snow losses must be documented immediately. Clara risked a glance toward the dining room doorway. Thomas stood at the head of the long table, his posture rigid with authority. Beside him sat a strikingly beautiful woman dressed in elegant winter attire, Eleanor Brooks. Clara's chest tightened as she studied the woman who had replaced her. Eleanor's blonde hair shimmered beneath the lamplight, her posture graceful and confident. She laughed lightly at something Thomas said, resting her hand possessively on his arm. Clara quickly looked away, a dull ache spreading through her ribs. Miss Whitmore. Thomas's voice cut through the room like a blade. Clara froze. Bring fresh coffee, he ordered, as if addressing any other servant. "Yes, sir," she replied softly. She carried the heavy pot toward the table, her hands steady despite the tremor threatening her composure. As she poured, Eleanor studied her curiously. "This is the woman who traveled from Chicago?" Eleanor asked casually. Thomas nodded dismissively. She misunderstood the arrangement. Clara felt the words like a physical blow but continued pouring without spilling a drop. "How unfortunate," Eleanor said, her tone polite but hollow. "I admire determination, though timing is everything, is it not?" Clara forced herself to nod respectfully before retreating to the kitchen, her vision blurring dangerously. From across the room, Samuel watched the entire exchange in silence, his hands curled tightly into fists beneath the table. The tension inside the ranch thickened over the next several days like smoke trapped beneath a low ceiling. Clara worked tirelessly, completing every task Margaret assigned without complaint. She rose before dawn, labored through freezing afternoons, and collapsed into bed each night with muscles screaming from unfamiliar strain. Yet exhaustion proved easier to endure than the constant awareness of Samuel's presence. They rarely spoke openly. Ranch routines and Margaret's watchful eyes ensured that, but brief glances passed between them across corrals and hallways, each carrying unspoken questions neither dared voice aloud. By the 5th day, Clara found herself assisting Samuel in the supply shed, tasked with cataloging winter feed rations. The confined space forced them into close proximity, the scent of leather and hay filling the air between them. "You're overworking yourself," Samuel said quietly as she scribbled figures into the ledger. "I'm earning my passage home," she replied without looking up. Samuel leaned against the wooden table, studying her intently. "Is that truly what you want?" Clara paused, her pencil hovering above the page. "I don't know what I want anymore," she admitted. Samuel stepped closer. "You haven't answered my question from the barn." Her heart skipped violently. "Because it isn't a question with a simple answer," she said. "It could be," he replied gently, "if you let it." Clara closed the ledger slowly, meeting his gaze. Fear, hope, doubt, and longing collided inside her chest until she could barely breathe. "You would be risking everything," she said. "Your position, your friendship with Thomas, your place here." Samuel smiled faintly, though sadness lingered in his eyes. "I risk those things every day by staying silent," he said. The confession shattered the final wall around her heart. Before she could respond, the supply shed door burst open violently. Thomas stormed inside, his face thunderous with rage. "I knew it," he growled, his gaze snapping between them. "I warned you, Samuel." Clara's stomach dropped. "I found your letters," Thomas continued, his voice trembling with fury. "The ones you wrote to her before she arrived, encouraging her, telling her this ranch needed her." Clara's blood ran cold. She turned toward Samuel, stunned. "You wrote to me," she whispered. Samuel didn't deny it. Thomas laughed bitterly. "My own foreman conspiring to undermine my marriage. How poetic." "I never intended to undermine anything," Samuel said firmly. "I intended to ensure she wasn't abandoned." Thomas stepped closer, his eyes blazing. "You forget your place." Samuel straightened, his voice steady and unyielding. "My place is beside what's right." The words ignited something explosive in Thomas. He shoved Samuel backward, sending crates crashing to the floor. Clara gasped, rushing forward instinctively. "Stop, please." Thomas turned toward her, his expression twisted with betrayal and contempt. "You," he sneered. "You brought this poison into my house." Clara froze, terror clawing up her spine. Samuel stepped between them, his voice low and dangerous. "She brought honesty," he said. "Something this ranch has been starving for." The two men stood inches apart, years of buried resentment crackling between them like lightning preparing to strike. Clara realized in that moment that whatever choice she made next would not simply determine her future, it would reshape the fate of everyone standing in that room. Samuel turned toward her slowly, his gray eyes filled with quiet, unwavering certainty. "Clara," he said softly, ignoring Thomas's furious glare. Tell him where you stand." Her heart pounded so loudly she feared it might burst. Outside, the wind howled across the snow-covered valley, carrying the distant rumble of another approaching storm. Clara drew a shaky breath, her hands trembling at her sides. And for the first time since stepping onto the platform at Cold Creek Junction, she understood that she was no longer choosing between two men. She was choosing the life she deserved to live. The supply shed felt suffocatingly small as 3 lives balanced on the edge of Clara's next words. The broken crates scattered across the floor smelled sharply of spilled grain and splintered wood, while wind whistled through cracks in the walls like a warning from the mountains themselves. Samuel stood protectively in front of her, his shoulders squared, his posture unyielding. Thomas remained rigid with fury, his chest rising and falling in jagged breaths. The silence stretched so tightly it felt ready to snap. "Clara," Samuel repeated gently. She swallowed hard, forcing her trembling hands to steady against her skirt. For so long, she had allowed circumstances, tragedy, and survival to make her choices. She had followed advertisements, letters, expectations, and desperation. But standing there between two men whose lives had been shaped by pride and loyalty, she realized something simple yet terrifying. No one could decide this moment for her. Thomas scoffed coldly. "Don't waste your breath, Samuel. She came here chasing security. She'll take whichever path offers comfort." The insult burned through her like wildfire. Clara stepped forward, her voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through Thomas's certainty. "You are wrong." Both men froze. Clara lifted her chin, meeting Thomas's glare directly. Fear churned violently in her stomach, but something stronger rose beside it, the same stubborn courage that had carried her across a continent alone. "I came here because I believed in keeping my word," she said. "Not because I was chasing comfort." Thomas crossed his arms. "And now, do you intend to ruin two men's lives because you cannot accept rejection?" Clara felt the accusation land heavily but refused to retreat. "I intend," she said carefully, "to live honestly." Samuel's breath hitched almost imperceptibly. Thomas laughed bitterly. "Then answer him. Do you accept his proposal?" The room seemed to tilt as Clara turned toward Samuel. His eyes held steady, patient, filled with a quiet vulnerability he made no effort to hide. He was not pleading. He was not demanding. He was simply waiting. For her, the realization struck deeper than any declaration of love ever could. "Yes," she whispered. The word hung fragile in the air before strengthening with clarity. "Yes, I accept." Samuel closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing the weight of the moment, before opening them again with a mixture of relief and fierce determination. Thomas's face darkened with disbelief that quickly twisted into rage. "You forget whose land you stand on," he growled. Samuel stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. "No, Thomas. I remember exactly whose land this was before pride turned it into something else." The statement landed like a hammer against years of buried resentment. Thomas's fists clenched, but this time he did not strike. Instead, his anger shifted into something colder, more calculating. "You are dismissed," Thomas said flatly. "Both of you. You leave this ranch by sunrise." Clara's heart lurched. Samuel remained perfectly still. "Winter storms are still crossing the valley," Samuel said carefully. "You're condemning us to death." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I am removing betrayal from my property." The cruelty of the words stunned Clara into silence. But before Samuel could respond, a new voice entered the doorway. "That is enough, Thomas." All three turned. Eleanor Brooks stood framed in the open shed entrance, her elegant coat dusted with snow. Her expression, usually composed and distant, now carried unmistakable frustration. "I have listened to your temper for 5 days," she continued, stepping inside, "and I will not allow it to destroy this ranch before our marriage has even begun." Thomas blinked, clearly unprepared for her intervention. "This is not your concern. It became my concern the moment I married you," Eleanor replied calmly. "And I will not begin my life here by watching you cast out your most loyal foreman and the only woman who has improved this household's morale." Clara stared in shock. Samuel looked equally stunned. Eleanor folded her gloved hands neatly. "You will give them 1 month. If they fail to establish their independence by then, they leave willingly. But you will not send them into winter storms fueled by wounded pride." Thomas opened his mouth to argue, but Eleanor's steady gaze silenced him in a way Clara had never witnessed before. After several tense seconds, Thomas exhaled sharply. 1 month, he muttered. "No longer." Samuel nodded slowly. "That is all we need." Clara's knees nearly buckled with relief. As Thomas stormed out, Eleanor turned toward Clara, studying her carefully. For the first time there was no mockery in her eyes, only quiet curiosity. "You have caused quite a transformation here, Miss Whitmore," she said thoughtfully. Clara managed a shaky smile. "I never intended to." Eleanor's lips curved faintly. "Neither did I." Samuel wasted no time. Within hours, he began gathering supplies, tools, and livestock agreements from neighboring ranchers who still respected his reputation. Clara followed him through every negotiation ledger and construction plan, determined to prove she was more than the catalyst of conflict. They selected a small parcel of unused land at the far edge of Calder property, land Thomas considered too rocky for cattle, but Samuel remembered his father once calling stubborn soil that rewards stubborn hands. The first weeks tested every ounce of their strength. They built a modest cabin from reclaimed timber, their fingers blistered and numb from cold and labor. Clara cooked over open fires while memorizing livestock records. Samuel worked from dawn until moonrise, repairing fences and preparing corrals with relentless focus. Yet beneath the exhaustion, something beautiful began growing. They laughed often, quietly, unexpectedly, sometimes at mistakes neither of them would have forgiven in their previous lives. They shared stories beside lantern light, slowly weaving together childhood memories, heartbreaks, and dreams they had long believed impossible. One evening, as snow melted into early spring mud, Clara stood outside their half-finished cabin watching Samuel repair a broken fence post. The sunset painted the valley in shades of gold and amber, turning his silhouette into something almost mythic against the horizon. "You still have time to change your mind," he called lightly, noticing her gaze. Clara walked toward him, wiping sawdust from her apron. "Not likely." Samuel planted the repaired post firmly, then turned to face her, his expression suddenly serious. "I never asked you why you truly came west," he said. Clara leaned against the fence, considering her answer carefully. "I came because staying meant becoming invisible," she said finally. "Every opportunity in Chicago closed the moment my parents died. I realized I could either fade quietly or risk everything on a chance to matter somewhere." Samuel stepped closer, his eyes warm with understanding. "You matter here," he said simply. Clara smiled softly, resting her hand over his. "And you gave me that chance." Their wedding took place 2 weeks later beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient cottonwood tree near their cabin. There were no elaborate decorations, no musicians, no grand ceremony, only a traveling preacher, 2 borrowed horses, and a handful of ranch hands who had quietly chosen to support Samuel despite Thomas's disapproval. Eleanor attended alone, offering Clara a small silver locket as a wedding gift. The gesture spoke louder than any apology ever could. As Samuel slipped a simple gold band onto Clara's finger, the valley wind stirred gently around them, carrying the scent of thawing earth and distant wildflowers. "For better or worse," Samuel said softly. Clara met his gaze with steady confidence. "For everything." Spring transformed the valley with stubborn determination. Grass pushed through thawed soil, rivers swelled with melted snow, and Clara's laughter slowly became a familiar sound across their growing ranch. Within months, neighboring cattlemen began trusting Samuel's operation. His reputation for fairness and Clara's meticulous bookkeeping created a partnership few could rival. Their small ranch expanded steadily, proving that loyalty and integrity could build success as surely as wealth and contracts. One warm summer evening, Clara stood on the cabin porch watching Samuel teach a young ranch hand how to saddle a skittish colt. The memory of the rejected foal from months earlier drifted back into her mind, reminding her how fragile beginnings often carried the greatest strength. She rested her hand gently against her growing belly, smiling as she felt the faint flutter of life inside her. Samuel noticed immediately. He jogged toward the porch, his eyes lighting with awe as Clara guided his hand to the subtle movement beneath her dress. "Is that?" he asked breathlessly. She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Our child." Samuel dropped to his knees, pressing his forehead gently against her stomach, laughter and emotion tangling in his voice. "You kept your promise," he whispered. Clara brushed her fingers through his hair, her heart swelling with quiet certainty. "No, we kept it together." Months later, as autumn painted the valley in brilliant amber and crimson, Clara gave birth to a healthy daughter. Samuel held the tiny infant with trembling hands, overwhelmed by a love he had never allowed himself to imagine. "What shall we name her?" he asked softly. Clara smiled through exhaustion. "Hope." The name settled over their home like a blessing. Years passed, and the small ranch Samuel and Clara built became one of the most respected operations in the territory. Travelers spoke of the couple whose partnership redefined what family and loyalty meant on the frontier. Even Thomas Calder eventually rode across the valley one quiet winter morning, standing silently at their fence as he watched children, 3 by then, chase each other through the snow. He never apologized aloud. Pride still held him prisoner, but when he tipped his hat respectfully toward Samuel before riding away, it spoke volumes. Clara stood beside Samuel on the porch that evening, their children laughing behind them as snow began falling gently across the valley. "Do you ever regret asking me that night?" she asked quietly. Samuel wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close against the cold. "Every day," he said with a teasing smile. Clara raised an eyebrow. "Because," he continued, pressing a kiss to her temple, "I wish I had asked sooner." She laughed softly, leaning into him as lantern light flickered warmly through the cabin windows behind them. The valley wind whispered through the cottonwood trees, carrying echoes of storms long past and promises kept against impossible odds. And as snow blanketed the ranch they had built from rejection, courage, and quiet devotion, Clara Whitmore finally understood the truth she had crossed a continent to discover. Sometimes the life meant for you begins the moment someone else turns you away, And someone brave enough whispers a new future into existence.